It is better now than never. It's an honor 70 years in the making. Canada's Bomber Command, the brave men responsible for our bombing campaigns in World War II, finally getting a special bar of their own. They didn't get one right after the war. The very idea of bombing didn't have a good reputation then, especially because of heavy civilian losses. But the federal government has decided they've waited long enough. Here's what the bar will look like. The few remaining surviving members of the Bomber Command can wear it on their Canadian Volunteer Service medals. Dr. Alex Hurd of the Memory Project joins us from Toronto with more on the history of the Bomber Command. Now, Dr. Hurd, we're so glad that it's finally happening, but I mean, it's so tragic. I can't help but think that, well, you tell me what the numbers are. My guess is more than 9 out of 10 of these men are no longer with us.
Yeah, well, I mean, generally there's less than 120,000 Second World War veterans left alive in Canada today. Obviously, many unable to really appreciate the moment now. So, yeah, and they're dying at a high rate every day. So, yeah, it is a shame that it took so long.
Give me some context for the genesis of the Bomber Command. Why did we need it? Why was it so important? Why was it the Bomber Command that saved our bacon in World War II?
Well, the British government came to the Canadian government early on in the war and asked for a place to train Commonwealth pilots and bomber crews and navigators and ground crew. And Canada offered, through a variety of sites throughout the country, places to train these personnel. So the genesis came from these training centers under the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan in Canada. And then Canadians began enlisting, volunteering and enlisting to join the Royal Air Force Bomber Command, and eventually, about midway through the war, the Royal Canadian Air Force had its own bomber group, No. 6 Bomber Group.
And why was it so important to the winning of the war?
Well, the use of the bomber, it was a relatively new thing in modern warfare. Going back to the First World War, you had the first aircraft in use as a weapon. Well, by this time the Second World War had come around, the development of these larger airplanes to travel farther distances were designed and strategized to use against industrial centers. So the idea was to bomb Germany's industrial centers in order for them not to make war, for them not to be able to make their own weapons and munitions. And so that was the main goal of RAF Bomber Command.
So is it fair to say, and I don't mean to insult any member of the infantry, but is it fair to say that if we only had infantry, and indeed if we only had our great Navy, it would not have been enough? We needed to soften up Germany, we needed to soften up their industry, we needed to take out a number of targets, we needed to take away their ability to make war, and the Bomber Command made the difference.
Well, I think it's fair to say that the Allies had established air superiority through both their fighters and their ability to bomb the enemy. So yeah, the air power played a very vital role and allowed, for example, the infantry to move inland and the armored units to move inland after the Normandy landings in June of 1944. So certainly, yes, aircraft played a vital role, especially for Canadians. And I would agree that they played this critical role and helped the other services win the war.
In percentage terms, I do believe our bombers took more casualties than any other aspect, any other division in the war. Let me just ask you this. Why was it so dangerous to be a member of the Bomber Command over the skies of Germany?
Well, you're dealing with, I mean, for example, for the RAF Bomber Command, their main policy was to bomb at night. So you're dealing with aircraft where you have to use the navigational aids at your disposal. You're dealing with German night fighters, anti-aircraft fire, inclement weather, the possibility that a wrong turn, you could crash into another one of your own aircraft. Extremely difficult and challenging circumstances. Plus, these aircraft were not necessarily the easiest vehicles to control. They were trained to go into a certain type of spin to elude enemy night fighters. Very difficult machines to control. So these are just some of the factors that add to the challenges of simply carrying out one's job.
Fair to say that even though you're flying in a squadron, you're very, very much on your own. The plane itself doesn't have anywhere the kind of equipment that we have today, where the average fighter has means to protect himself.
Right, exactly. I mean, the fighters today, you could have all sorts of sensors and radar equipment to detect where you are spatially. This wasn't necessarily the case with these, Halifaxes and Lancaster bombers that the Canadians flew in during the Second World War.
Were the people, these brave men who flew them, were they all volunteers?
Yes, they were all volunteers. They were all signed up to join the Air Force and serve in some capacity. Many ended up joining, Royal Air Force units, and then the rest ended up with, for example, the RCAF's own bomber groups and fighter groups.
Did they have any idea when they were signing up for Bomber Command or were signed up for Bomber Command, did they have any idea how dangerous the mission would be?
I don't necessarily think they did. Again, the horrors of the First World War led to a lot of people saying, okay, well, I'm going to avoid the infantry, so I'm going to join the Air Force, which was, again, a relatively unknown challenge for service personnel because it was a relatively new service with relatively new capabilities. So the challenges they faced during the Second World War, from actual surviving a bombing run to poor weather to mechanical difficulties, I don't think anyone really had a general sense until the end of the war what they were getting themselves into.
Can we talk about the public relations after the war? Because I think it's a vital component of why it's taken so long to honor these men. It's one thing for soldiers to be going up against soldiers on the, I'll call it the conventional battlefield. But this isn't a conventional battlefield. This is soldiers in the sky going up against, in many cases, civilians and wiping out a lot of civilians. Isn't that what made it so difficult to publicly honor the men?
Well, yeah, I think that was part of it. I mean, again, the use of bombers against densely populated urban centers where the enemy industrial power lay was a new concept in modern warfare. And it was when the war ended, the powers that be had to assess, for example, what they had done and how that would be received by their respective publics. I do know that the higher leaders in Britain, for example, and the United States, really actually agonized over the fact that they had caused this, what we would consider collateral damage. And I think that just adds to the sort of, the idea that it was not something that should be spread about publicly in the post-war period.
Dr. Hurd, we've got less than a minute left here, but I do want to give you an opportunity to tell us from a personal perspective, what brought you to this assignment, this mission?
Well, the thing is that I run what's called the Memory Project out of Historica Canada here in Toronto, and we interview veterans of the Second World War, including Bomber Command, and we put their stories online. And then we also have a speakers bureau where we send these same personnel members out into the public to give their firsthand experiences, and they can be the ones that can explain to Canadians why their role was important and what they did during the war. So that's what brought me here to this mission.
Folks, I encourage all of you to Google Historica Canada. It's a wonderful organization that we support, and they support us as well. They support our viewers on the Sun News Network. Historica Canada and Memory Project. Google Historica Canada Memory Project. You'll learn a lot about a very, very important part of Canadian and world history. Dr. Hurd, thanks for everything you do, sir.
Thank you.